Right?
Yeah. Except the toaster doesn't make my place smell good. If I turn it all the way up, put my toast in, turn the toast down, let the toast come back up, and then put the toast down again for the second time.
I just imagine. All right. So this happens as
When's the last time you heard it?
So we have special speakers here today, real quickly, from the Orr Fellowship. We've had multiple students in the past couple of years participate in the Orr Fellowship. Chandler Chapman,
Yes, Chandler.
and then last year, Bryce.
Chris Chandler.
Oh, Kristen, Bryce's brother. Participated in it, and so they're here to give a little bit of a sales pitch on why it's awesome and why you should consider it as an option here. I know there's a number of you who are seniors in this class, and it's a really good fit with the systems program. And so they asked if they could come speak in a few classes. I thought this was a really good fit, since it is, the Orr Fellowship is a good fit with the systems program. So they're here to give you more details than I can, and a more personal story than I can. So I'll let you guys introduce yourselves and go from there.
Cool, thank you. This is a large class. I'm a little intimidated when I'm being recorded, but we're just gonna go for it. So I'm Catherine. I graduated in May. I have a degree in developmental economics, and this is Mike. He graduated a year ago now, and he has a degree in marketing. Recognize a lot of your face because I think we've talked to we've been in classes of a decent amount of people in the room, but you'll hear it again. So, yeah, so we're part of the Orr Fellowship, which is a 2-year post-graduation opportunity. So whether you're graduating in December or May, Orr Fellowship could be an option for you. So it's not an internship, it's not anything like that, it's a full-time job. And essentially, at the very basic level, you are put at a host company and you can rotate around within that host company and get your feet wet in a few different departments and get some executive level mentorship. And there's a lot of other really neat things that go along with Orr. And generally we explain it to people with 3 C's, career, curriculum, and community. And Mike is going to launch into career.
Yeah, so the foundation of Orr is career. So for those of you that are graduating soon, you think about what you want to do next, Orr is an option. One other thing, it is a good fit for systems. Orr attracts people from all different types of majors. From just Taylor fellows alone, we've covered Spanish, computer science, or I don't know, computer engineering, physics, marketing, and developmental economics. So, and that's a pretty good example of Orr in general. So, those types of people get placed in one of 60 to 70 different host companies. So, Orr Fellowship is represented by 60 to 70 different host companies that the fellow, or us, goes and spends 2 years there. So, the host company that I work for is called Cluster Truck. It is a kitchen concept that delivers food all over downtown. We've got 2 kitchens all over the Midwest, and we do that with technology. Catherine works for the Federal Home Loan Bank of Indianapolis, doing stuff completely different than I do every day. And that's also very indicative of what our fellowship is. We've got companies from 3 employees, where the fellow is literally the 3rd employee, probably making more money than the founder is, to Roche Diagnostics, which is thousands of employees, one of the largest companies in the world. And then companies in between, which is where we would fall.
Yeah.
So if you're interested at all in leadership, entrepreneurship, business, no matter what major you come from, and you're interested in Indianapolis, Orr Fellowship is something you should think about.
Yeah. The second C would be curriculum. So Orr offers a lot of our internal programming that we put on like ourselves as an organization. And so that could range anywhere from business leader speaker series. And we had Mitch Daniels come talk to the fellowship one time. I had no clue who he was, but he was a governor of Indiana. Now he is the president of Purdue. So cool guy. Then we also had this woman called Allison Langdon come talk to us. She ran the Super Bowl when it was in Indy, and now she's the CEO of the Indy Motor Speedway. So some really neat people in Indianapolis to come impart some wisdom on us. We also have Workshops that happen every couple months. We just had a workshop on implicit bias. There's been design thinking workshops about code, some really neat things. There's also, do you want to touch on the stipend?
Yeah. Each fellow for each year, so for 2 years, gets a stipend to pursue some sort of continuing education, whatever would interest you. So you could do a project management cert, or SEO, or take a class on a language, or a host of different things. A lot of people do the LSAT, or that sort of thing. So that's provided for in addition to your salary.
Yeah. And people do all sorts of stuff with that.
Yeah.
There was a fellow that I was at the bank with me, and she was a communications major. She actually was given the opportunity to lead the rebrand of the entire bank. And it's like a 200 to 300 person company, and she led the rebrand of it. And then she liked that so much, she got some certifications in like marketing and SEO, and like she was just really interested in the rebranding aspect, so she learned more about that. The third C would be community, which was a big selling point for me. I lived on 3rd Center Olson all 4 years and found great community there. And as most Taylor students maybe think, like, where am I going to find community after Taylor? And Orr has been an incredible community. Between me and Mike's class, there are 112 fellows. So basically any time of the day, if you want to be doing something, you could do something with fellows, whether that's more basic, like going somewhere to eat in Indy, or there's been fellows, recently a group of fellows just went to Peru together. And there's a group of fellows planning a trip to hike Mount Kilimanjaro. So there's really, like, you can hike Mount Kilimanjaro if you want, you can go to coffee shop downtown, there's all sorts of stuff happening, and there's also a really neat Christian community that's like building up in Orr. Every other Thursday, one of the board members, his name is Jim J., him and his wife Marcia and their 4 boys have us over to their home for something called Fellowship of the Fellowship. And it's basically a Bible study. We just talk about Jesus and worship together, and it's really neat to be taken like out of this Christian community, but put into like another community where there is pockets of like Christians in it. And in the last class, we touched on like some of the really neat opportunities that has provided to talk about Jesus, that to people that don't know him at all, or to people that have heard but they're curious, don't really know what he's about. So that's provided some really neat like ministry opportunities even. But overall, the community is like huge. It's incredible.
Yeah, I would say for me, in my experience at Taylor's, I was a Bible major for part of Taylor, and then became a business major, and was really trying to figure out like how to combine those. Even though it sounds a little bit simple as I'm saying this now, but I really have this desire to write and preach and to discover God's word, but also I really like business, just the simple things about business. And as I've gone through this now for 1.5 years in an organization that isn't Christian at all, one of the most fulfilling things has been getting to spend so much time with 112 people who you can relate to on so many things, but are also really curious about your faith, and are smart and have thought through a lot of really important questions, and are great for thinking through things, but don't necessarily believe what you do. And like I was sharing in the last class, even just having lunch a few times with a couple of guys who we've just kind of shared informally, it's become more formal what I believe, and as they've kind of asked questions, that's been like one of the highlights of post-Taylor. As funny as it sounds, you live in this community all the time and everyone believes it, and you go to chapel all the time, like leaving Taylor when no one knows that stuff, or no one really lives that stuff, believes that stuff, it's really different. So having some of those relationships and being surrounded by people who are willing to engage that and share what they think, what they believe, and kind of coming to relationship through that has been pretty awesome.
Yeah. So if you're interested in Orr at all, we're going to be in the garage room today at 4:30 for an informational session. We're going to talk a little bit more about our personal experience, a little more into the application process, how you get placed, all the questions. So I've said this in a couple classes, Mike and I want Taylor students to be in Orr. We're really excited about Orr, and we love Taylor still, present tense. And would love for Taylor students to be interested and to be in Orr, and so we're here to help you guys. We want to answer any questions you can have. We want you guys to be in Orr.
Yeah.
So anything we can do to help. I'll leave some of my business cards on this table. You guys can take them if you want. Otherwise, we'll be in the garage at 4:30, or you can email us.
All right.
Yeah. Any questions now, or we'll ask at 4:30 if you come?
All right.
Cool.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks for having us.
Oh, yeah, you bet. All right. So, Friday I felt was kind of a little rough, and that was mostly on me. And I want to apologize. I was especially convicted at church on Sunday. We were talking about James chapter 3 and the extra responsibilities that a teacher has for those who hear them. And I felt especially bad when I'm thinking about how Friday's class went. I have another class this semester that is pretty tough for me to teach. What happened is I spent too much time trying to prep for it, and I wasn't as fresh as I should have been on class on Friday. And so that's why I feel like I owe you an apology that I wasn't as prepared as I could have been in class on Friday. So let's try to redo what we went through in class on Friday. All right? So maybe the best way we can do that is if we open our books up to problem 223, which is the Easy Rider Ladies Sport example. All right?
Okay. I like the color.
And just to remind you, with this one,
Business majors, not compliance majors, okay?
problem number 223. I don't know what page that is, especially since you have two different versions of your books, right? Or the three. You have three different All right. So the optimal solution. Does someone remember what the optimal solution was? Like that? And the profit at this point was $960,000. Okay? So, if we were so if we're going to ask the same question, remember we're asking the question, what happens if some right-hand side coefficient changes? So rather than being in abstract A's and B's and so forth, like I tried to do on Friday, let's ask the question, what happens if we have an additional 150 hours of engine manufacturing time? How is that going to change our final solution? Okay? So how does that change our setup? Does it change our objective function? No, this is not. Our objective function is still the same, right? We have the same amount of profit for each of these two bike types, right? What does this change? It modifies one of the constraints. Which of the constraints does it modify? It changes the constraint that was 6e plus 3l, right, is less than or equal to 2100, right? And what we do to it is we're going to add 150 onto the end of there, right there, right? So if we think about this constraint now, this constraint is going to have the same slope as the old constraint did, right? Because all we changed was this right-hand side. Remember, the slope of this is going to be negative. Oh, that's great. Is going to be negative 6, because that's our x, over 3 equals negative 2. That's the slope of this line right here. It doesn't matter what this value is to look at our slope. And so when we're graphing that, if our old constraint looked like this, it's going to move outwards, but it's still going to remain parallel to their old one. Like that. It moved, representing those 150 hours right there. And the other constraints remain the same. Right? So we had another constraint, where's my black pen? Which was 2e plus 2.5L is less than or equal to 1,000. Right? And we saw when we solved this earlier that these two were the binding constraints. Right? There was a third constraint, and we'll get to that in a second, but these are the two binding constraints of our original problem. So let's look at what the slope of this is. The slope of this is going to be negative 2 over 2.5, which is what? Negative 4? Negative 2 divided by 5 halves. Yeah, so it's equal to negative 4/5. Right there, right? So that's going to be more of a slope kind of like this. Yeah, right? And I'm approximating it here because the exact numbers I'm going to give you so we don't have to see the full graph. So this was, since these were binding, this point right here was our optimal solution. Okay, and what we've done is we've moved this red line outward here now. So we've traveled along this one binding constraint, because it didn't change. It still remains binding, toward our new updated constraint right here. This becomes our new objective solution, our new maximum for our objective function right there. So this point right here, we said gives us a profit of $960,000. It turns out that this point right here, the profit is an even $1 million. Okay? If we compute the intersection of these two lines right here, what you'll find is that the E is 291 and 2/3. L is 166 and 2/3. And if you plug that back into the profit equation, you will get exactly $1 million right here. Okay? So now let's revisit this idea of the dual. Okay? Okay, the dual, we're going to say, is going to be the ratio of two values. It's the improvement of the objective function over the change in some right-hand side of an equation, of a constraint. Okay, so we're going to take that ratio. Because what we want to see is if we change this right-hand side by 1, can we predict how much the corresponding change in the objective function is? Okay? So what is the improvement in our objective function when we go from here to here? 40,000. We went from 960,000 to 1 million, right? So we have $40,000. Right? How much did our right-hand side change in the constraint? It changed by 150. right here. So if we compute what that ratio is, we will see that it becomes 266 2/3 dollars per hour. So for every hour of additional manufacturing time that we could somehow add to our system, we would expect to make 266 2/3 dollars. So think about that from a management perspective. If you have the option to hire some new worker to add hours on the line, maybe it's not just one worker because it's a series of workers through a new line. If you add up all of their salary, all of their benefits, all the insurance that it costs to hire them, and total it together, you could quickly compare that with this 266 2/3 and say, is it worthwhile for our company to hire that additional labor in order to produce more work? Because we expect this additional profit. So can we afford those additional costs? And that's where you start to see some of the limitations of our two variable model. Those costs should have already been incorporated into our model. The cost of labor, the cost of additional electricity, additional things. But because this is a simple model, and those aren't incorporated, we could answer those kinds of questions. Can we afford to do that? Now, this has some inherent limit. We can't keep adding more and more manufacturing hours. There's going to be some point in time where that is no longer true. In this example, I'll just draw a hypothetical line right here where this is our axis. Well, it's the E axis in this case. Okay. If we keep moving this red line because we add more and more and more manufacturing hours, eventually that red line is going to be way out here, right? And it turns out that moving it further isn't going to help us because the X, or the E axis in this case, provides a constraint, a new constraint. And so we can only move this manufacturing hours to the point where it intersects those 2 points right there. Okay? But if we move it beyond that, then making that move does not get us a single dollar extra. We're limited by our profit by the intersection of those two constraints instead.
So the line that intersects right where the E-axis and the other line intersects, so that one, yeah. Is it guaranteed that will always continue to make you more money? In this example, at least? Like, as long as
Up
you keep
until
moving?
this point,
Yeah.
yes.
Okay.
For every single, that's why we put it in terms, this per unit change in RHS is going to give us this much dollars. That's why it's dollars per hour here, because
Okay.
this is formulated in terms of hours.
So then once you figure out the dual, then you know if it will just keep improving or getting worse.
Right, so
Okay.
if you're adding hours or if you're subtracting hours.
Okay.
Mm-hmm. And it turns out that this point in time right here is not 150, but it's 900. Right. If we have 3,000 hours of manufacturing time available to us, then that would move this red line all the way here. And at this point right here, our solution would be that we would make 500 Easy Riders, and we'd make 0 Lady Sports. Right here. All right?
So, at that point, you would be making the most profit that you possibly could.
Mm-hmm.
But incrementally, you would be making more profit than the last.
No, up until this point, the dual remains the same. If I went from here to here, 1 unit of 1 hour, it still is 266 and
Oh, okay.
2/3. It's 266 and 2/3 for every single unit I go along this line until I hit this point. So we can predict what the value of this profit should be, right? How many units did we improve this by? 900. We know what the dual is. So someone bring out a calculator and multiply those together. What's 900 times 266 and 2/3? 240,000. So it turns out that is the correct solution. That if we could make a profit of $1.2 million right there in this example. Okay? But if we had any more hours, if this was at 900, but this was 901, our profit would still be $1.2 million. If this was 10,000 hours, our profit would still be $1.2 million because we've moved this out of a binding constraint into a non-binding constraint by the way we've moved it. So this is another way that we can make a management decision. How much extra labor do we put to make the manufacturing time available? We don't want to move it beyond this point because it stops being valuable. So when we phrase a dual, it's on a range. It's not an absolute value where you say the dual of this constraint is always 266 and 2/3 dollars. What you say is, if I move the constraint along the other binding constraint from this point to here, it's $266. And also here, but we're going backwards, so we're losing $266. So if we have a storm and we have to shut down the plant, we can predict how much loss there's going to be for our product because we're not able to manufacture it as well, right? The dual gives us that direct information. But just like moving in this direction eventually hits a constraint, moving in this direction is also going to hit a constraint. Okay, there is a third constraint, and I think it's horizontal in this case right here, right? Something like that. And so if we move this constraint backwards, eventually this, not the constraint we're moving, but this black one that we were moving on, stops being binding. So if we move it right here, there's been a change in how we travel along these constraints right here. So this is another inflection point right here. So our dual is only valid between these 2 points right here, between where the red and the black constraints are valid. As soon as any constraint stops being valid because we've moved our constraint too far this direction, or we've moved it too far this direction, our dual is not going to be the same. We moved it this direction until here, our dual was 266. Beyond that point, what was our dual? 0, right? It didn't matter how much we moved it. We didn't make a dime more in profit, right? We move it this way, as long as we're moving along that black line until this point, our dual remains 266 and 2/3. Okay? Once we move it beyond this point, there's a new dual in play. The dual that it relates to the red constraint and this green constraint. Okay, so let me give you an example. This point right here happens, excuse me, if we reduce this value, use an eraser because I'm tired of so many numbers up here. This point right here is 1742. Okay? If we move it to 1740, it's would have the intersection of all 3 constraints. The red constraint, the black constraint and the green constraint right there. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going, and just so you know, the profit at that point, profit at this point is $864,000. Okay? So I'm going to move this constraint just a little bit smaller. I'm going to move it down to 1,734. Okay? So now, instead of the black constraint being valid, now it's the green constraint combined with the red constraint that becomes valid here. Okay? And so at that point right here, in this example right here, our new profit is $861.6 thousand right here. Okay? So how do we compute? Let's erase it. Oh, no, that's not erase it. How do we compute the dual, the new dual that represents the red constraint interacting with the green constraint, rather than what the dual we had here with the red constraint interacting with the black constraint right here? We're going to do this same ratio right here. So what's the improvement, or in this case, it's a loss, right, because we know we're reducing. What's the loss of our objective function there? It's 864,000 minus 861.6 thousand, right? And what's the change in the right-hand side? It's 6, right? We went from 1740 right here down to 1734.
That's
Right.
6 or negative 6?
Well, it would be negative for both. So I'm just, because we went down here and we went down here. And it turns out, if you plug this into a calculator, you get a new dual of $400 per hour. Okay? So it means while we move along this green line, we even see a further penalty if we go to the left, or a greater increase if we go to the right here. All right? And we get that range, turns out, until we hit the L axis. Right there. And then, of course, you can't go any further left. You've hit the extreme case in that. Well, you'll go down. So you get a third dual until you hit the origin, and you're not manufacturing anything. All right? So the dual is used by us specifically to be able to answer and ask questions about what if, or should I, what happens when. Because oftentimes those types of questions are going to be reflected in changes like this to a particular constraint. We have something more available, or we have the opportunity to have something more available for us. Or we lost the ability to use something. And based on that, then that's going to provide extra profit, or cost us more money, whatever the scenario is. And the dual allows us to understand and predict that, because we know that these are linear equations, it is going to be directly related. For every unit that changes in our right-hand side, either positive or negative, we're going to have a positive or negative effect to our overall objective function. All right. Let's try working this out with an example problem. Turn to problem 3.2. I think we started working on that last week, so we didn't do so hot. Yes. Yes.
Is 3.2 a dual?
That's it. So a good model would have additional constraints that is incorporated in. But because we're limited to 2 variables, it doesn't. So yeah, you would have to incorporate, oh, is this overtime or is this additional hiring? Yeah. Well, your dual doesn't change, but what does change is, does it become valuable or not? Yeah. It might not be worth it to you anymore because you have to start paying overtime. You have to hire and that you have to pay additional benefits. Yeah.
It actually probably turned me off.
Are we doing this problem from scratch?
I'm getting back into it.
Problem 3-2.
Okay.
3-2 refers to 3-1, right?
Yeah, are we starting like from the beginning of this problem going all the way through it?
Yeah, but I won't ask the change in the coefficients of the objective function, right?
We're just working on the dual.
So the dual part of it,
Okay,
right? So notice how problem 3-2 works, right? It uses the problem from 3-1, and it shows you what the output from a software solution would be there, right? It says that it's got a dual value for each of the constraints, because each constraint has its own dual, because changing them is going to have a different effect on your objective function. And it gives you a range. That range tells you the validity of that dual. Right, so in that table, for problem 3-2, notice for constraint 1, it tells you what your current right-hand side value is, what the allowable increase is, or the allowable decrease, or, depending upon which version of your textbook, it tells you what your lower limit and your upper limit are. Right? And that's the range that the dual is valid. Okay? So notice constraint 3 there. What's unique about constraint 3 compared to the 2 other constraints? It doesn't have a limit. Why doesn't it have a limit? What kind of constraint is it? It's already non-bound. It's a non-binding constraint. And so if you increase its value, it doesn't matter because it already wasn't affecting the solution. So the value on that one, that limit, is when it would start affecting the objective function. And until you lower it below that value in that table, it's not even a binding constraint. And so the dual, up until that point, what should the dual be? What should the dual of a non-binding constraint be? 0, right? Because if you change it, it doesn't change the value of your objective function. So if you change it by 1, you change it maybe by 100. It shouldn't change your objective function until it becomes binding. All right? Yes, Josh.
If you, if it was, say your optimal solution to the point where 3 constraints intersected, should all 3 constraints have the dual?
Yes. They would, but the say like that right there. And let's say we're doing a maximization problem right here. They are all at a limit, right? So if you move this constraint in this direction, it's going to become non-binding. So the dual in for this one only would reflect, it would have it could only move in the direction to reduce the objective function. If you moved it in the other direction, it would become non-binding. And that's true of any of the lines in here, right? If we move this one here, it would stop being, if we moved it here, now it would be out of the feasible region. And this last line right here, if we moved it in this direction, it would move out of the, so all three of them in this case are on the edge of the dual range. And the dual range can only get smaller and not get larger when you have that three-way intersection like that. But they do have a dual because you could move them in this direction. And you could reduce the objective function because of any one of those constraints. But if you increase them, it wouldn't make a bit of a difference. It's kind of a unique perspective.
Do they have different duals?
Yes, every line has a different dual. Every constraint has a different dual because they have a different slope. And so you're going to increase each variable at a different rate. And you have different coefficients for each variable in your objective function. So the combination of those two things are going to mean that moving one line is going to cause a change in an objective function differently than moving another line would. All right. All right. How many of you were able to get through problem 317 for today? So, at least the beginning, part where you were talking about the change in the objective function. Hopefully, let's look at that.
That's my turn.
Okay.
I messed up at first.
Okay. Someone remind me what we said our first step when we are solving these problems is. Define our variables. Okay, so what should be our variables in this problem? Variables, okay, which are they?
BRP and BRW.
Okay, and I'm going to shorten it because I'm lazy to B and W. And it kind of sounds nicer. All right. Where this is the number of the DRB units, and this is the number of the DRW units. Okay, what's our second step in our process? Define our goal. What do we want to do here? Max our profit. Okay. What are our constraints? Okay, steel available. I heard that up here. What's the equation for that?
200B plus, not 21B.
Okay, I was like, my notes don't match that.
W is less than or equal to 40,000.
All right. All right, next. What's another constraint?
Manufacturing limits.
Okay. And what's the equation for that?
40B plus 100 is less than or equal to 140,000.
Okay. Back behind them, what's another constraint?
Assembly minutes.
All right.
60B plus 40W. So it's going to go to 96,000.
Logical constraint. Next one over.
100%.
There isn't any. Good, good. All right. All right. So which one, since we're running low on time, I won't draw our diagram again. I'll depend upon your having worked on it already. What did you identify, back corner here, as the binding constraints?
Steel and manufacturing.
Right, these are binding right here. Okay? And what was the solution? Oh, wait, we didn't do step 4. What's step 4? It's the equation for our goal, right? So the equation for our profit is okay. So if these are binding constraints, right, you could compute where they intersect, right? So where do they intersect? What's the value of B?
1,000.
1,000. The value of W is 800, which leads to a profit of $424,000. Okay? So the next question then is, we have an opportunity to buy 500 more pounds of steel, right? At, what is it, $2 a pound, something like that? And the question is, we're trying to figure out, is it worth it? All right. So what we have to do is we need to figure out which constraints we're going to move this one, right? And we're going to travel along this constraint, and we have to see how long it would travel before this new constraint would become binding instead. Right? So if we move it outward, what is going to happen to that? So what you can do is check what is the intersection of these two lines right here. All right? And it turns out that intersection is approximately all right. And if we, that's where the intersection of these two lines are. So if we plug B and W back into this equation, why are we doing that? So what we have is we have something like this equation, and let's say this is number 2, constraint number 2, and this is constraint number 3 right here. And let's say number 1 looks like this. When we add 500 pounds, we're moving this outward like this right here, right? And so what we want to do is we want to figure out, does moving it outward stay here and keep it binding, or does it move outward like this and it's no longer binding? That's what we're trying to do. And so we figured out this point right here, where it would no longer be binding. That's what this value B and W represent, is that point. And so we're now going to plug this back into here to see how far along B and W would intersect with that point, to see if this point represents the blue case or the red case right here. Okay? So it turns out, if we plug this back into here, what we find out is that would make this value be 40,909.09 and so forth, which is larger than the 500 pounds that we're going to make available. So that means we are in this blue line case here, where we're not going, our adding 500 pounds would keep that constraint as being fine. So we're going to be at that point right there. Okay? Questions so far? All right.
So you're just plugging the B&W in there and that creates the
This point right here, I'm plugging it into here to see whether it's to the left or right. Yes.
You already know that.
This black one? Well, you can now intersect this and this new line, which is not 40,000. 40,000 higher than the old. But that's just going to give you a B and a W, and if you just look at a raw B and W, you won't know whether